HOA Karen, demanded my wife hand over our newborn, unaware I'm a Navy SEAL. I had just lived through a father's worst fear. At sunrise, the HO president herself kicked my door off its hinges with a pack of hired muscle, then lunged straight for my newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in her crib. Her justification? A bogus court order she apparently printed after one too many glasses of wine. The only thing actually tested that morning was my ability not to wipe that smug smile off her face. But let me start from the beginning. The first sound I heard wasn't the door breaking. It was the cry of my baby girl. Grace, only 3 days old, shrieked from the bassinet beside our bed. It was sharp, startled, the sound of innocence suddenly torn apart. My eyes flew open, and before my brain even caught up, I was already on my feet. Then came the crack of splintering wood. The front door, the one I had painted a cheerful blue just last weekend, was blown clean off its hinges. It slammed into the wall so hard the whole house shook. My first stupid thought was about the drywall. Great, now I'll have to fix that. Then the shouting started. "Child Protective Services, we have a warrant. Don't move." The voice was female, shrill, brimming with that fake authority I knew too well. Instinct kicked in. I moved to the door, putting myself between it and my wife, Kylie. She sat upright in bed, clutching the sheets, her face pale with exhaustion from her recent C-section, now twisted in terror. Pain flickered across her features as the stitches pulled tight. "David, what's happening?" she whispered. I had no answer, just a raised hand signaling her to stay quiet. Boots pounded against the hardwood, many of them heavy and deliberate. They weren't sneaking, they wanted us scared, and it was working. My heart hammered, but my body was steady, my breath calm. Old training took over. The bedroom door crashed, open, and there she was. Karen Lowe, queen of the cul-de-sac, ruler of our HOA, framed in the doorway like a villain out of some bad play. Her blonde hair lacquered into an unmoving helmet, her lips slashed with bright red, curled in a smug grin. Behind her stood 3 men in cheap tactical gear, their faces hidden by dark visors. They looked less like professionals and more like mall cops on a military surplus spree. One carried a gurney, and to complete the circus, a skinny guy with a professional video camera stood at her side, its red light blinking as it captured everything. "There they are," Karen announced, for the camera, her voice booming with fake sympathy. "The unfit father, the incapacitated mother, and the poor baby." She jabbed a manicured finger at me. "David Martinez, you are a danger to your family. We're here to rescue your daughter." "Rescue," the word twisted out of her. Mouth so wrong it made my stomach turn. She held up a paper. "This is a court order signed by a judge. Custody is being transferred immediately." The cameraman zoomed in, then back to Kylie, who sobbed, clutching her stomach in agony. Grace, overwhelmed by the noise, wailed louder, a raw, helpless cry. "You can't do this!" Kylie pleaded. "She's only 3 days old. She needs me." Karen ignored her, waving to the thugs. "Take the baby. The mother needs psychiatric evaluation." 2 men stepped toward Grace. The third unfolded the gurney with a metallic clank. That was the breaking point. Whatever patience I had left burned away. They were not laying hands on my child, or my wife. My mind switched to combat mode. The oak chair by the window, the lamp with a heavy base, the goons' sloppy stances, Karen standing too close. "Step away from her," I said, my voice flat and cold, sounding like someone I thought I'd buried years ago. They hesitated, looking to Karen. She laughed, a cruel bark. "Don't listen to him, he's bluffing, grab the baby." The first man reached for Grace. Time slowed. Kylie's horrified eyes, Karen's smirk, the red recording light. I moved. I swung the oak chair into the goon's helmet, the crack echoing like a gunshot. His visor shattered, and he fell back screaming. One down. I drove my shoulder into the second, wrenching his wrist until bone ground on bone. He shrieked, dropping to his knees as his weapon clattered away. The third charged with the gurney, too slow. I sidestepped, tripping him face first into the carpet with a crash that shook the floor. 5 seconds. 3 men down. Karen's smile vanished. The cameraman froze, lens still aimed at me. I stood breathing hard, knuckles bleeding, scanning the room. Then I snarled at her, "Get out of my house!" That's when sirens blared outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the window. 2 deputies stormed in, guns raised. "On your knees! Hands behind your head!" My chest sank. Of course. Karen had planned this. She'd called them ahead, painted me as violent, unstable. To them, I looked like exactly that. A man who had just attacked 3 officials. I glanced at Kylie. Tears streaked her face as she clutched her stomach. I had no choice. I dropped to my knees and laced my hands behind my head. Cold. Cuffs bit my wrists. As the deputies pulled me up, Karen's smirk returned, nastier than before. "See?" she purred. "Exactly like I told you. Now secure the child before someone else gets hurt." They lifted Kylie onto the gurney, still in her hospital gown, while Grace's cries pierced the chaos. The thugs wheeled her away. Karen clawed for Grace, the cameraman trailing, filming her victory. But outside, the plan unraveled. Sirens overlapped. A flashbang went off. Black-vested figures fanned across my driveway in disciplined formation. Karen had no idea. None of them did, because my defenses hadn't started that morning. Every camera in and around my house wasn't just recording. They were streaming live to a secure server, monitored by a few old friends. Friends who weren't just law enforcement. They were the best kind of law enforcement. And I knew, even as they dragged me out in cuffs, that help was already closing in. That day, when Karen smashed into my life, wasn't the beginning. It was the end of a year-long road. A road that started the moment Kylie and I first saw this house. It seemed perfect. A cozy 2-bedroom bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood called Oakwood Creek. The backyard was big enough for the dog we always talked about getting, and the extra room was already in our heads, earmarked as a nursery. It was supposed to be our forever place, the one where we could finally settle after years of moving from one military base to another. All I wanted was peace, to wake up in the same bed every morning, to actually know my neighbors, to live a life so ordinary that the most exciting part of my week was deciding what to toss on the grill Saturday evening. Kylie wanted that too. She deserved it more than anyone. She had followed me around the world without complaint, turning every temporary house into a home. This house was my way of keeping my promise to her, a quiet, normal life. We closed in the spring, and at first it felt like a dream. We painted walls, planted flowers, and slowly got to know the folks around us. Across the street was a sweet older couple. Next door, a young family with toddlers. And then there was Fred, who lived 2 houses down. He was a widower in his late 70s, a retired postal worker with a mischievous twinkle in his eye. On our second day, he showed up with brownies and a ton of unsolicited lawn advice. "Don't let the dandelions get a foothold," he warned, pointing with a bony finger. "They look harmless, but they'll take over everything." We liked him instantly. He was the quirky, grandfatherly neighbor every community should have. Fred was also the first to warn us about Karen Lowe. "She's the queen bee of the HOA," he told me one afternoon while I was wrangling my new lawnmower. "And she takes the queen part literally." He explained she'd been HOA president for nearly 2 decades, backed by her high-powered attorney husband, living in the biggest house in Oakwood Creek. According to Fred, she ran the neighborhood like her private kingdom. "She's got a rule for everything. The color of your mailbox, the flowers in your beds, even the height of your grass. And yes, she measures. I laughed it off. I'd dealt with my share of rigid bureaucrats in the military. How bad could one nosy woman with a clipboard be? A week later, I found out. I found an envelope waited under our doormat, embossed with the HOA letterhead. Inside was our first violation notice. Our crime? A garden gnome Kylie's grandmother had given us as a housewarming gift. Section C, paragraph 4 of the bylaws declared, all lawn ornaments needed prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. That committee consisted of exactly one person, Karen Lowe. We had 48 hours to remove the gnome or pay a $50 fine. I was furious, but Kylie, ever the peacemaker, just sighed. It's silly, but let's put him in the backyard. It's not worth it. I gave in, but it left me simmering. It wasn't about neighborhood standards, it was about control, and the gnome was just the beginning. The violations piled up over the next months, a fine because our trash cans sat, visible on the curb for 2 hours after pickup, a warning because our mulch wasn't on the approved brand list. I tried approaching Karen at the annual HOA barbecue, hoping for a little reason. Karen, I started, I think there might be a misunderstanding about these notices. She didn't even let me finish. She looked me over like I was dirt under her shoe. There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Martinez, she said icily. The rules are the rules. Maybe if you spent less time questioning them and more time following them, we wouldn't have this problem. Then she turned her back and walked away. That was the moment I understood. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was enjoying the misery she caused. Fred confirmed it. He told me how every few years she picked one family as her target, grinding them down with fines and threats until they finally sold and left. Looks like you're this year's lucky winner, he said grimly. The breaking point came when Kylie got pregnant. We were overjoyed. After years of trying, we were finally going to have a family. But the constant stress from Karen's harassment began to affect Kylie. Her blood pressure spiked. The doctor warned she needed calm, but calm was impossible when Karen prowled the neighborhood like a hawk with her ruler and notepad. That was when I knew it had to stop. Petty fines were one thing, but when it touched Kylie and our unborn child, the line had been crossed. I thought her cruelty came from boredom and entitlement. I didn't realize it was part of something bigger, something far darker. The shift came on a cool autumn afternoon. The air was crisp, the leaves starting to turn. Kylie, 6 months pregnant, had finally begun to relax. For a few weeks, Karen had been quiet, and we let ourselves believe she'd moved on. We were sitting on the porch swing tossing around baby names when a sleek black car pulled up. A man in an expensive suit stepped out with a leather briefcase. His smile was polished, predatory. He introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, representing a development firm interested in our property. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer, he said smoothly, sliding a folder into my hand. Inside was anything but generous. It was barely above what we'd paid, ignoring the improvements we'd made and the rising market. Worse, it was insulting. We had no desire to sell. I'm sorry, I told him, handing the folder back. This is our home. We're starting our family here. His smile didn't fade, but his eyes hardened. Perhaps you should reconsider. It's a strong offer, and your neighbor, Mrs. Lowe, is very supportive of our project. She believes it will greatly benefit the community. And there it was. The mask slipped. This wasn't random. It was Karen's play. I'm sure she does, I said flatly, but we're not selling. The smile vanished. He snapped his briefcase shut. That's a shame. I think you'll regret this. With that, he left. And as his car drove off, I caught a curtain shifting in Karen's window across the street. She had been watching every second. The next day, the flood began. 3 violation notices in a single morning. A $200 fine for a driveway crack that had been there before we bought the house. A $100 fine because our porch swing didn't count as approved recreational equipment. And the most absurd, a warning that the soft yellow paint we'd used in the nursery was visible from the street and not on the approved interior palette. I snapped. I stormed across the street, clutching the notices, and pounded on Karen's door until she opened it. She greeted me with mock sweetness. "Mr. Martinez, what a surprise." "You know what this is," I spat, waving the crumpled papers. "This has to stop. You're harassing my pregnant wife. You're trying to drive us out of our home." "Enough." Her smile was cold, empty. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm simply enforcing the rules you agreed to when you bought your home. If you don't like them, perhaps you chose the wrong neighborhood." I wanted to yell, to break something, to wipe that smirk off her face. But all I saw in the reflection of her spotless glass door was myself, angry, boiling over, and exactly where she wanted me. That was exactly her goal. She wanted me to snap, to lash out, to give her the kind of reaction she could twist and use against me. But the disciplined part of me, the one trained to analyze before responding, took control. I inhaled slowly, forcing the anger to stay buried. "This isn't finished," I said in a low, even tone. "You picked the wrong person to mess with." Her grin widened just slightly, the kind of expression a predator wears when it knows the prey is cornered. "Oh, I don't think so," she whispered. "Some people can't recognize what's best for them. But they always learn, one way or another." Then she shut the door in my face. I stood on her porch for a few seconds, the still hum of the neighborhood mocking me. I had walked straight into her snare, shown her my temper, and confirmed I was affected. As I crossed back to my own house, I spotted my neighbor Fred trimming his rose bushes. He glanced up and gave me a heavy, understanding look. No words were needed. We both knew what that exchange meant. I had just declared war, and deep down, I suspected Karen Lowe was far more practiced in these battles than I was. I didn't yet understand how low she was willing to sink, or how ruthless her methods would become. After that night, her harassment escalated from petty irritation to outright psychological warfare. She wasn't just pushing us to sell anymore. She was trying to break us. Notices started arriving daily, each one more absurd than the last. A fine for leaving a watering can on the lawn for 60 minutes. A citation for a roof shingle she claimed looked out of alignment from the street. A complaint about excessive noise because I mowed the lawn on a Saturday afternoon. It was a slow grind, a barrage of petty cuts, and it was wearing us down. Kylie was unraveling. Each time the mail showed up, her shoulders stiffened. She stopped enjoying neighborhood walks, terrified she'd run into Karen. The home we had dreamed about turned into a cage. I knew I couldn't win on her turf. The HOA was her fortress, and the bylaws her scripture, twisted and weaponized however she liked. Arguing with her was as useless as shouting at a wall. So I shifted tactics. I fought the way I knew how. My disciplined military side resurfaced. I began documenting everything. I bought a ledger and recorded each fine, each notice, each conversation. I snapped dated, time-stamped photos, perfect shingles, the watering can gone after an hour, every so-called violation. I built a thick file, a growing record of her campaign. Then I took another step. I boosted our security. I told Kylie it was for the baby, that you can never be too cautious with a newborn. That was true, but not the full truth. I installed a top-tier surveillance system with high-definition cameras covering every angle of our property: the doorbell, garage, porch, backyard, sides of the house. I even mounted tiny hidden cameras in the eaves, aimed straight at Karen's home. The real brilliance wasn't the cameras themselves, but the setup. All footage streamed directly to an encrypted cloud server, not a local drive. It was the kind of system we used overseas for remote ops. Over the top for suburbia? Probably, but I knew it would pay off. Fred became my unofficial informant. He'd wander over with his coffee, sharing scraps of intel. Saw Karen's husband meeting that developer again last night, he muttered one morning. They had blueprints spread across the hood of his car. He told me about families she had destroyed, people bled dry by fines and endless legal battles. A retired teacher forced into a second mortgage because Karen fined her thousands over unapproved wind chimes. Fred's usual humor was gone when he warned me. She's a shark that smells blood. Be careful, son. She doesn't just want to win. She wants to ruin you. His words haunted me as Kylie's due date neared. The stress was crushing. We were preparing for the happiest moment of our lives, but all under the weight of Karen's torment. The doctor was concerned. Kylie's blood pressure was still too high. They even discussed inducing early, every day. I tried to calm her, promising her I'd handle everything. But inside I felt helpless. I had sworn to give her a peaceful life, and instead dragged her into a battlefield. Then it happened. One night, her water broke. We rushed to the hospital, panic mixing with excitement. All the fear and anger about Karen vanished. The only thing that mattered was our daughter. After 18 grueling hours and an emergency C-section, Grace was born. She was perfect, tiny, with a shock of dark hair and my nose. The moment I held her, a fierce, almost physical love washed over me. She was my world, and I would do anything to protect her. Those 2 days in the hospital were a calm bubble, far from Oakwood Creek and its tyrant. For 48 hours, we were simply a happy family. Leaving the hospital filled me with joy and dread. I couldn't wait to bring Grace home, but I feared stepping back into the fight. As we pulled into the driveway, everything looked quiet. No notices. Karen's house still. For a fleeting moment, I hoped maybe even Karen would leave us in peace with the newborn. We carried Grace inside, believing the nightmare was over. But that hope was our first fatal mistake. Her silence wasn't mercy. It was the calm before. Her most vicious move. The raid that followed was chaos. 1 minute I was cuffed, watching everything collapse. The next, help arrived. A black van and 2 county SWAT trucks screeched to a halt. But these weren't regular cops. This was Rick's unit, Reserve SEAL instructors temporarily working with county SWAT. Their black vests, stamped in bold yellow navy, gleamed under the lights. They moved with precision I recognized instantly. They stacked at my broken door, tossed in a flashbang, and stormed the house. It was over in seconds. Deputies froze in shock. Karen's thug with the gurney was pinned in an instant. My old platoon brother, Sergeant Rick Downing, now SWAT commander, snatched the fake warrant from a stunned deputy. He glanced at it, then at Karen. "This is forged," he said flatly. He pulled out his phone and showed the senior deputy our live feed. "We have video of you breaking in, audio of you admitting there's no CPS case. We have bank transfers, from your husband's firm to this agent's personal account." He pointed at the shaky man with the camera, now pale as death. Everything flipped. My cuffs were removed and slapped onto Karen instead. She didn't argue, just glared at me, with pure hatred. Her husband, hiding down the street, was caught too. The fake agent and thugs were hauled off. Real paramedics finally arrived, loading Kylie and Grace into an ambulance. They were safe. Watching the van carry Karen and her crew away, I felt a rush of victory. We had won, but it didn't last. The next morning, Rick called. "You're not going to like this," he warned. "She's out." I was stunned. "Out? How?" He sighed. "The DA's office dragged their feet. Word is Karen's got him in her pocket. Her husband's law firm dropped a 7-figure bond like it was nothing. And the district attorney's office? They were dragging their heels. They kept framing it as some complicated civil matter that spiraled out of control. They were handling her like she was fragile. My stomach dropped. Of course, her husband wasn't just any attorney, he was a powerhouse in the city. They had money, influence, and clout. The kind of power that makes criminal charges quietly vanish. Then phase 2 of her attack began. This wasn't about HOA notices anymore. It wasn't even about intimidation. This was a war for perception. A local gossip blog, infamous for its clickbait and shady ethics, ran a headline: "Local hero HOA president attacked by unstable veteran." It quoted unnamed neighbors, calling me dangerous and aggressive. The article painted Karen as a selfless protector defending a vulnerable child against a violent father and an unstable mother. It was character assassination dressed up as journalism. My military record was twisted into proof I was a walking time bomb. Kylie's normal postpartum exhaustion was rewritten into a tale of severe mental illness. The story exploded online. Suddenly, our faces were plastered everywhere. Strangers who knew nothing about us were calling me a monster and labeling Kylie unfit. Friends and family were bombarded with calls from reporters. Even Kylie's mom, 3 states away, saw the smear campaign. We had fought and won inside our bedroom, but we were losing the bigger war for our names, our dignity, our peace. Karen had evolved from a neighborhood tyrant into a media-savvy predator with lawyers and PR experts polishing her image. She was flipping the script, casting herself as the victim and me as the villain. A despair I hadn't felt since my darkest combat tours crept over me. I had faced enemies armed with rifles and explosives, but I had no idea how to battle lies and innuendo. The legal system, the very shield meant to protect us, was being bent against us. The satisfaction of seeing her cuffed soured into a sickening truth. She wasn't going to face justice. She was going to ruin us, and she'd do it with a smile, wrapped in privilege and influence. I looked at Kylie, trembling as she tried to feed Grace, her hands shaking too much to manage. Our baby slept soundly, unaware of the chaos. And that protective fire in me reignited hotter than ever. If the law wouldn't deliver justice, then the law was no longer my path. I couldn't just defend anymore. I had to strike back. And I knew this fight wouldn't be won in court with evidence or witnesses. It would be fought in silence with shadows and secrets. The following days were the darkest of my life. The system ignored us. The media crucified us. Kylie was a shell, terrified to pick up the phone, terrified to check the internet. She sat for hours just rocking Grace, her eyes hollow. One evening, she broke down completely. "We have to leave, David," she sobbed. "We need to sell the house, get out, disappear. She's going to destroy us." I held her, heart breaking. Part of me wanted to agree. Running seemed like the only sane choice. We could vanish, start over. But another part of me, the fiery part that refused to yield, knew better. Leaving meant surrender. If we ran, Karen would win. She'd take the house, build her condos, and move on to torment the next family. And what kind of life would we live? Always hiding, always afraid. What kind of lesson would that teach my daughter, that you run from bullies? No. I couldn't let that happen. This was the turning point. Do I keep playing by the rules of a rigged system, or do I create my own? That night, after Kylie and Grace were asleep, I wandered the neighborhood and stopped in front of Fred's house. His lights glowed inside. Through the window, I saw him staring at a photo on his mantel. After hesitating, I knocked. He opened the door and silently let me in. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and we sat in heavy silence. "She's going to get away with it, isn't she?" I finally muttered, the words like poison. Fred took a long drink and stared at the photograph. It was a young man with a wide, hopeful grin. "That's my son, Michael," Fred said, voice thick with grief. "He was a good kid, started his own landscaping company right out of high school. Got the HOA contract for the common areas." He was proud. He paused, eyes lost in memory. But he underbid Karen's cousin. She never forgave him. Fred's story was a grim echo of mine. First came the petty fines, parking violations, noise complaints, then delayed payments for his work, constant threats, endless paperwork. She bled his business dry. He lost his company, his home, his savings. Bankruptcy crushed him. A week later, Michael ended his life. In his note, he wrote her name, Karen Lowe, calling her poison that had seeped into every corner of his world, until nothing good remained. I was horrified. This wasn't about greed or power. Karen was a deliberate destroyer, not just a bully, a killer. Any hesitation I had evaporated. My moral fork in the road turned into a straight, narrow path. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. Fred shook his head, eyes wet but fierce. "Don't be sorry. Be angry. Be smart. Don't let her do to you what she did to him. Protect your family. Fight her with everything you've got. Everything." I nodded, a cold resolve settling in. I finished the whiskey, the burn nothing compared to the fire inside me. I knew what I had to do. The law was useless. Reason was useless. The only language someone like Karen understood was watching her own world collapse. I returned home, sat at my desk, and pulled out my phone. Scrolled to a name I hadn't dialed in years, a name tied to shadows and gray morality. The call connected on the second ring. "It's been a while," a gravelly voice said. "Yeah, it's me," I replied. "I need a favor, the kind we don't talk about on open lines." A pause. Then, "Thought you were out of the game, Dave." I glanced at the baby monitor, Grace's tiny form resting peacefully. "They pulled me back in," I said. "And this time it's personal." That call set everything in motion. The man on the other end, an old ally known only as Echo, was a ghost, a master of digital warfare. He didn't pry, he just asked, "What do you need?" So I told him. Everything about Karen, her husband, their shell company, the harassment, the attempted kidnapping. I sent him files, logs, photos, surveillance footage. He went to work immediately, and he wasn't alone. He pulled in other specialists from our old unit, guys who could follow money, trace assets, and exploit human weakness. While they dug in digitally, I turned to the ground war. My first move? The HOA's finances. As a homeowner, I had the right to inspect them. I filed a formal request for an audit. The panic was instant. Karen's husband's law firm fired, back with threats and excuses about improper burden. That was all I needed to know. They were hiding something. And while they tried to stall me, Echo's crew was already inside their systems. They didn't bother with the front door. They slipped quietly through the back entrance. What they uncovered was shocking. For years, Karen had been treating the HOA like her private piggy bank. The fees collected from homeowners were secretly being funneled into a shell company under her maiden name. With that money, she covered her landscaping bills, pool upkeep, even her property taxes. She had siphoned off hundreds of thousands of dollars, but that was only scratching the surface. The real story was tied to her husband and his development firm. That business wasn't a real company at all. It was a front, a laundering machine for some very dangerous people in organized crime. The condo project slated for our land wasn't about housing. It was about cleaning millions in dirty money. Our modest home wasn't just an obstacle to construction. It was blocking an international criminal operation. The attempted abduction of our daughter suddenly became horrifyingly clear. It wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated strategy. If they could get us branded unstable and unfit parents, they could seize our property through the courts and free the path for their project. Evidence poured in, offshore accounts, encrypted messages, dummy corporations. The fraud was a web of lies spanning years, all orchestrated by Karen and her husband. But then we uncovered something else, her real weapon. Karen's influence didn't just come from her husband's fortune. She was an expert in blackmail. Echo's team dug into a hidden encrypted folder on her personal computer labeled insurance. Inside was dirt on nearly every local power player, a councilman's gambling habit, a building inspector's affair, a judge's secret addiction. She had spent years gathering secrets, twisting the city's leadership into submission. She wasn't merely bribing officials, she was holding a knife to their throats. We had enough to put Karen and her husband behind bars for life and topple an entire network of corruption. But handing it to the local police or DA was suicide. Karen had them in her pocket. They would bury the files and leave us exposed. We needed a way to release everything at once, beyond her reach. Our solution was a three-stage strike. First, we would compile the financial crimes, embezzlement, tax fraud, money laundering, and drop it anonymously on the IRS's Criminal Investigation Unit. They answered to Washington, not to local politics. Second, we would feed the blackmail files to the same gossip blogger who had smeared my name. Let him tear down the people he once protected. Third, and most important, we would deliver the kidnapping evidence and the organized crime ties straight to the FBI. It was dangerous. We had to cover every digital step. One mistake, and Karen would know the hammer was coming down. My office became a war room for a week. I barely slept, living on coffee and fury. Kylie noticed the light glowing under my office door at night and the shadows under my eyes. She didn't press me for answers. She just watched with something new in her gaze. The fear was still there, but now it was blended with a fragile hope. She knew I was no longer running, I was fighting back. The fuse was ready. The data was encrypted, uploaded to anonymous servers, timed to release simultaneously to the IRS, the FBI, and that shameless blogger. It was surgical, a remote-controlled demolition of Karen Lowe's empire. I sat at my desk running through the final checklist when a soft knock came at the door. My heart spiked. It was late, too late. My first thought was that Karen had sent another team of thugs. I checked the cameras. It wasn't strangers. It was Fred, my neighbor. He stood on the porch, clutching a worn hat, his face pale and haunted. He looked like he had seen something unspeakable. I let him in. Without a word, he walked stiffly to the armchair and sat, his movements shaky. "Fred, what's going on? What happened?" I asked, my mind racing. Did Karen know? Had our plan been discovered? He looked up, eyes filled with turmoil. "I need to tell you something, David," he whispered. "I haven't been completely honest with you." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" He drew a deep breath. "The advice I gave you, pointing you toward the HOA books, toward her husband's business, it wasn't random. I've been nudging you because I already knew." The confession spilled out. Fred's son's suicide had broken him, but it had also forged a slow-burning quest for justice. For nearly 10 years, he had dedicated himself to quietly gathering dirt on Karen Lowe. He had spent his retirement learning public records, corporate filings, background checks, assembling a case piece by piece. But he was only one man. He had information, but not the resources to act. Then I arrived. He'd heard I was ex-military. He saw me stand up to Karen. He knew I was the ally he had been waiting for. The goofy neighbor wasn't just comic relief. He was a covert investigator who had been guiding me from the start. But that wasn't his real bombshell. "Your hacking is good," he said. "But you missed something. Something she'd never keep on a computer. Something only I know about." He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn, leather-bound book. It looked like a diary. He handed it to me. "What is this?" I asked, tracing the faded lettering. "That," Fred said, his voice like stone, "is the family Bible." He explained that Karen's father, the HOA president before her, had built the original empire of corruption and taught his daughter every trick. The book was his ledger, decades of extortion, bribery, and crimes, written in his own hand. I flipped through. The names and transactions made my blood run cold. It was a roadmap of half a century of rot in our town. Then I found a name that froze me in place. The current district attorney. Next to it, a payment, hush money, covering up a hit-and-run committed by the DA's father that had crippled a child. Suddenly, everything made sense. Karen's bail, the DA dragging his feet. It wasn't just influence. She owned him. She had his entire career in her grip. He wasn't a neutral prosecutor. He was her puppet. Our plan to involve the local DA wasn't just risky. It was suicide. If we handed him the evidence, he would bury it to protect himself and warn Karen. She'd crush us before the feds ever heard our names. I looked at Fred. His expression was a mix of sorrow and grim triumph. He had just handed me the smoking gun that tied everything together. The monster we were fighting didn't just haunt the city. She controlled the very people meant to stop her. The careful digital strike was dead. The IRS and blogger drops had to be killed immediately. The only chance left was to get the ledger and our entire evidence package directly to the FBI, bypassing every state and local channel. Anything less, and we were finished. Echo came through again. He had a contact from his shadowy past, now working inside the FBI's Public Integrity Division in Washington, D.C. The battlefield had changed. The danger was tenfold, and the war was only beginning. It was risky, but it was the only move left. We had to arrange a face-to-face meeting, a direct exchange without anyone in the middle. But before that, I needed to keep Karen pinned down. I had to hold her in place until the feds arrived. I needed a confrontation. This was when the calculating side of me took over. I had to bait a trap, and the bait had to be her own arrogance. I called on a lawyer I trusted from my military days, not some local puppet she could influence, to draft a settlement offer. It was humiliating, pathetic on purpose. The document claimed I, David Martinez, was unstable from combat. It said I'd overreacted. It offered her a public apology. And in return for dropping her complaints and signing a non-disclosure, I'd sell her our house for the same insulting price her developer first offered. Total surrender. Everything she had ever dreamed of. To a rational person, it would scream, trap. But Karen Lowe wasn't rational. She was ruled by her ego. The thought of me crawling back, beaten and broken, was irresistible. Her husband, the lawyer, was cautious. He saw through it. But Karen, blinded by pride, overruled him and agreed. She demanded the meeting take place in the HOA Community Center. She wanted a crowd for her big win. Perfect. While she prepared her stage, I set mine. Kylie and Grace were flown to my parents in another state, well out of danger. Neighbor Fred acted as my lookout, working with a small team from his home across the street. And Echo kept a secure line open with his FBI contact giving live updates. The feds were already on their way. The trap was ready. The night was cold and rainy. The community center, a sterile place meant for potlucks and HOA meetings, felt like a tomb. I walked in alone. Karen sat at the head of a long table, smug, like a queen on her throne. Her husband stood behind her, arms crossed, suspicion on his face. Two fresh goons in cheap suits guarded the door. Papers were neatly arranged on the table. "Well, Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice dripping with cruel delight. "I knew you'd finally see sense. Pity your family had to suffer first." I stayed silent. Let her bask. This was the critical part. A wire hidden on me was feeding everything to the FBI team waiting in a van nearby. I needed her to talk. I needed her to confess. "Sign these papers, transfer the deed," she went on, tapping a manicured finger on the stack. "And I'll make a call to the district attorney. I'll tell him you've come to your senses. Maybe your charges vanish." Amazing what cooperation can do. I gave her a little nudge. "And you're certain he'll listen?" I asked, pretending defeat. Karen laughed loud and sharp, the sound bouncing off the walls. "Oh, darling," she leaned forward, whispering as if sharing a secret. "He always listens. Everyone listens when you know they're dirt. Ask his father. Or poor Fred, his boy found out what happens when you don't. Hearing her mention Michael's death so coldly froze my blood, but I held steady. I needed more. All this for condos? I pressed. Her husband shot her a warning look, but she ignored it, drunk on her own power. The condos are only the start, she bragged. They're a machine, Mr. Martinez, a luxury machine for laundering money, and your land was the final piece. She'd admitted it all. Extortion, blackmail, conspiracy, laundering, and it was all recorded. Just as she slid the papers and pen toward me, the double doors opened. Not a loud SWAT storming, but calm, precise. Half a dozen agents in dark jackets marked FBI walked in. Their quiet, steady presence was more frightening than shouting. The lead agent, a tall woman with cold gray eyes, walked straight past me. She didn't even glance at the goons frozen in place. Her eyes were fixed on Karen. "Karen Lowe," she said firmly, "you're under arrest for racketeering, fraud, and extortion." Another agent stepped forward and cuffed her. Karen's smug look dissolved into stunned disbelief. The agent then turned to her husband. "And you, Mr. Lowe, you're under arrest for bribery and laundering. We also have a warrant for every file in your law firm." As they were restrained, the only sound was the rain on the windows. It was clean, precise, final. From across the street, I saw Fred's porch light flicker, a signal. Karen glared at me as she was led out, her face twisted with hatred. She had been beaten completely, but even in chains, she was still a monster. The battle was finished. The war was won. But staring into those eyes, I couldn't help but wonder. Was it truly over? 6 months later, I sat on my front porch swing, the same one Karen once fined me for. The warm sun filtered through the oak, children laughed down the block, and a lawnmower hummed faintly. It was the sound of peace, of normal life. Grace lay in my arms, bigger now, smiling with Kylie's bright blue eyes. Her gummy grins filled me with joy. The house was ours, free and clear. The shadow that hung over it was gone, burned away by justice. Karen and her husband sat behind bars without bail. Her father's ledger and her taped confession sealed their fate. The case against them was massive, enough to keep them in courtrooms, then prisons, for life. The DA resigned in disgrace, and the FBI purge tore through half the city government. The empire Karen built collapsed. A judge dissolved the HOA. At first there was disorder, but something better took root. Freed from her rule, neighbors began talking again. They formed a voluntary association with simple rules. Fred became interim president. His first act was tearing down the community center. In its place, with donations from families Karen had hurt, they built a community garden. At its heart, a bench with a brass plaque, in memory of Michael and all those who deserved a better neighbor. Kylie stepped outside carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed me one, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her smile was real now, not the fragile one she'd worn for months. Therapy was helping, and little by little, the carefree woman I loved was returning. "It's quiet," she said softly, gazing down the peaceful street. "Yeah," I replied, leaning into her touch. "It is. We sat there together, just watching life unfold. I thought back to the question that had haunted me through all of this. How far will a man go to protect his family? Now I knew. As far as it takes. With fists, with cameras, with secrets and evidence, you fight until they're safe. I hadn't wanted this fight. I came here looking for peace. But I learned peace isn't found, it's made. Sometimes you have to tear down the old world to build a new one from its ashes." Looking at my wife, my daughter, and the home we had saved, I knew with absolute certainty It had all been worth it. The war was over. We were safe. We were home. And this time, it was forever.